So welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Bethany Servin and I work in marketing here at UsableNet. Today's webinar is Lead the Change, Embedding Accessibility as a Core Value. This webinar is produced by UsableNet, a recognized leader in accessibility and digital inclusion. And our speaker today is Jeff Adams. I'm going to hand it over to Jeff and let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Bethany. Great to see everybody joining today to talk about some ways to get accessibility embedded into your organization. It is absolutely one of my favorite topics to talk about in my work here at UsableNet. I'm the Vice President of Accessibility Operations here for UsableNet. I've been here coming up on 13 years now, and the things that I do, I advise companies around the world on best practices around website accessibility and integrating these practices into their processes, which of course is one of the larger hurdles that one might have in accessibility beyond just remediating websites is actually getting that embedded into the process. My work in accessibility goes beyond UsableNet as well. And I work with creative entrepreneurs and solo entrepreneurs to understand accessibility for what they can do inside the platforms they work on. And actually co-wrote a book with a UsableNet colleague called Content for Everyone to help them as they try to make their digital presence accessible as well. For today's agenda, we're going to start by talking a little bit about web accessibility in general and company processes. Then we'll talk about transforming a company's DNA, which is really where, some of the work really starts to go into. Before we change any processes, we've really got to get the company ready to take on this new requirement around accessibility. And then we'll talk about building that inclusivity from the top, going down the chain and sideways through the organization to really get the most number of people we can on board around digital accessibility. And then I'll give you some next steps to get started. And then, as Bethany mentioned, we'll leave time for Q&A too. So, make sure as we go that you're putting some questions into the Q&A panel so that we can have a good discussion when we're done going through the presentation. So let's talk about web accessibility and company processes a little bit. And we'll start with one of the key things, just about accessibility in general. And that's the understanding that we need to have that accessibility issues are everywhere. I know sometimes I talk to companies who are like, we still have accessibility issues. And one of my first messages there is you're not alone. You're not isolated in having to work through these. One of the data points that I like to see is the information that comes from the WebAIM Million Survey, which they do every year, looking at the accessibility of the top 1 million homepages. And they're looking at a very narrow focus here on this, but it does help us to understand the big picture here at the same time. This look at the million homepages is only on issues that could be determined through an automated scan, which of course are a finite number of things in terms of the broad web content accessibility guidelines success criteria. Probably 20–25% of that can be actually understood through automated scan, but we still see large numbers here. If you think about those million homepages, which is everything from things like Google and Amazon that are at the top through any number of sites, looking at the traffic of those sites. So it goes down to, some smaller sites. 95.9% of those homepages have accessibility issues. And across that, there's like 56.8 average errors per page. For just looking at automation and coming up with a number of 56.8, that's a lot. And you could imagine that number could easily double, if not triple, if we were looking at the full set of web content accessibility guidelines and everything that we could look at in those success criteria. They break down some of this in terms of category of sites. And I wanted to take that and lay it over the information that we have from our legal analysis that we're always doing in terms of the top categories that actually can get accessibility lawsuits filed. E-commerce, of course, is always the top one. 75–80% of the suits go against e-commerce sites. And there we actually see the average number of errors per page increase from that 56.8% to 83.3%. And in the parentheses here, I say shopping because that's the category that the survey puts them into. Looking at food service, which the Million survey calls food and drink, little under there, 51.6 errors per page. Education sites have about 48.3 average errors per page. And then healthcare, which the survey calls health and fitness, 51.7 average errors per page, looking at those home pages. And I will say for e-commerce, where we look at that one, the only category of pages that had more issues on the homepage than e-commerce was sports. So that tells you how high that is there too. If you're interested at all in checking out more about the Million Survey, if you haven't seen those results from earlier this year, you can go to webaim.org/projects/million. Some really interesting data there. So why are these issues everywhere? And there's really a lack of understanding even today, even when we're almost 25 years since the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines came into existence and web accessibility started to get talked about more, there's still not a broad understanding of how many people actually live with disabilities and how large that group is between the numbers of those who have permanent disabilities, but those who experience temporary and episodic and situational disabilities every single day. There's also not a big understanding around the impacts of those people when digital products are not accessible, from screen reader issues for those who might be navigating with assistive technology, issues with color contrast, issues with keyboard navigation, focus indicators. There's not a big understanding of what that means. Of even more concern is this is not a topic that's taught a lot as people are coming up in the industry, or even for those who've been in it for a while, it may not be part of their continuing education. So for those who are designing, creating content, developing code, testing for accessibility, they may not know how to do that and that it should be part of their everyday routine. It's still an evolving idea on how digital accessibility impacts a brand. Everything from, losing customers because something's not accessible, customers taking their complaints and going viral with them on social media, and of course, customers turning those complaints into lawsuits. Not to mention just the impact of lawsuits from, the serial filers that are out there. One of the things we're going to get to in this presentation is the idea that accessibility needs to be at the center of every single digital project that happens, whether it's website, an app, your email campaigns, your social media posts. Accessibility should be considered at all aspects there. And then, of course, the big question and kind of the holy grail that's there is creating the sustainable accessibility program so that you become less reactive to these things and much more proactive so that it's part of the everyday work. But how do you get there? How do you get accessibility into your processes? And this is difficult for many companies because it comes as a new requirements for the teams to manage. It's not just getting an audit and remediating against it or getting information from user testing with members of the disabled community. It's about making it become part of the things that you look at, no matter what project you're doing, where it sits in your process. All of this starts, of course, as a project because when it comes in, you're usually reacting maybe to a lawsuit or maybe just the understanding that you need to do better for your customers. And so you get an audit, you get testing, you start working with a company like UsableNet, and we start to look at these things and how to get remediated. But from there, you have to learn how to make sites and apps and content accessible. It's not enough just to remediate. You need to understand why you're remediating and how not to repeat those mistakes. Therefore, you start to integrate it into your processes because, of course, you want to make sure that you're starting to shift left so that as you're remediating, not only are you doing maintenance well going forward, but any new projects and new initiatives really start to take hold and have accessibility as part of the definition of done for those individual items as they move through the development lifecycle. Of course, all this takes resources and focus, and that can make it really hard for the teams to pick it up because they're already moving so quickly to take care of the projects that are already on deck, that then to turn around and have to integrate a new aspect into the processes. Everybody has to kind of pause and take a minute and go, okay, we're deliberately starting to insert this and understand how that might reverberate through timelines, at least for some amount of time as people get used to the new requirement. So how do we go about transforming the company's DNA to really taking in and accepting accessibility as part of what's going to be happening throughout the process? Well, I want to look at this from the idea of progress over perfection. This is often talked about around accessibility, that it's important to make progress. Perfection's where you want to go. Perfection's often very hard to get to, as is true with any aspect of a website, right? There's always things to do in the backlog while you're continuing to do work. But around accessibility, it's about progress. And as I think about progress, I was thinking about this quote, which is in the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. And this book is primarily around self-improvement and setting goals for yourself around whatever aspect of your life that may be. But this particular quote, I think, is apt when we think about progress over perfection and working on accessibility. And James wrote, habits are the compound interest of self-improvement. And as you make the habit, it becomes the thing that just becomes ingrained in you. And as you thought, and think about accessibility that way. As designers, always design for accessibility. Content creators are always creating content with accessibility in mind. Developers are coding with accessibility in mind, and the testers are testing with accessibility in mind. And everybody surrounding those teams thinks about accessibility as something that's important. The habit just grows more day after day after day after day. And like anything in your personal life, if you break the habit and you start not doing it day after day after day, the improvement you realize from having the habit can start to deteriorate. And the same is true for an accessibility program as well, that you can lose all the progress you made and then have to do it all over again. So you want to have those habits. You want to continually make progress. And that takes having attention at the right levels within an organization. It can't just be one or two people who are like, accessibility is important. And that's true, even if it's somebody on the executive team saying it. Because if there's not buy-in going down, it can be very hard to get everybody doing it, even if it's some kind of a company mandate. Each individual here can play a role in having conversations that can help build those advocates and build those champions. And we'll be talking about that coming up in the next section in particular. But when I think about, some of the key roles for champions, it's definitely executives, because if you don't have executive buy-in for this work, it can be very hard to make it have traction. Having the human resources department and any diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders involved can be helpful here too, because they want to look out for the employees of the company from the human resources side. So accessibility should definitely be on their mind for both internal and external. And certainly from the DEI side, you're not only looking at DEI internally, but how it also reverberates out to your customers. All the product and marketing stakeholders are key, because if the stakeholders are bought in, they're helping to create the resourcing and the budget and the time to be able to do this work. IT and tech leaders, very key, because they're often responsible for, the websites and the apps running properly, and making sure that they're keeping up with any coding best practices, which accessibility definitely connects to. Everybody doing the work needs to be on board here too. If you've got one designer who's designing accessibly, but three others aren't, then there's a disparity there. So you kind of want the entire team of designers all doing accessible work. And then ideally, everyone who's at all touching the digital properties are also on board here, just to keep that habit and that progress moving forward. So how do you move toward that accessibility first mindset as you're starting to build these champions? You need to look at a company-wide accessibility policy that clearly outlines the organization's goals on accessibility. And this is so important. Even if you're an organization has a single website that you're responsible for, having this policy still, sets the goal and the outline of what everybody has to do. But going broader, if you're a global company managing hundreds of websites, the policy becomes even more critical so that everybody across all of those teams, including any vendors, understand what's expected and the accountability that they'll have against it. Certainly, if there's DEI involved, make sure accessibility is part of that mission so that it is understood for employees and customers what the objectives are around any initiative of that kind. I highly recommend having an accessibility center of excellence where your people who are the SMEs internally around accessibility, those subject matter experts, kind of come together and help form the policy and help spread education and knowledge throughout the organization. And also educating the company as a whole on why accessibility is important beyond the digital teams. I've seen great success with organizations who have big, like town hall style meetings where one of the things they talk about is accessibility and how it, is impacting the digital experience of the mindset, because it can help people, if they are in the disabled community, it can help them feel really included in what the company's doing, knowing that they're doing the accessibility work. But then it becomes something that could be talked about too as good work the company is doing. Achievable goals here are so important. This is not something that can happen, at the snap of a finger or simply writing the policy. These things take time. Uh, if you were at the webinar we did a few months ago with Heather from Skyscanner, that's been a multi-year project for them to get their accessibility program in place and also to keep it going and to make sure that it continues to mature. 4 years on, they still have things they want to do to be even more mature. So it's important to understand, timelines around remediations, timelines around changing process, but then having the bigger picture to know that process change takes time. The bigger the organization too, the longer that'll take. And it's ongoing learning throughout the company. It's coming to webinars like this and the other webinars that UsableNet does. It's getting that continuing education out there and not trying to just learn it once, which is why the certifications, have these continuing credits that Bethany mentioned, because you have to keep learning and understanding what's going on. Draft and adopt the accessibility policy. Once you decide you want to do that, put like a 90-day window around that to get it drafted and to start to get it implemented. Same thing around the education or the Accessibility Center of Excellence, rather. Make sure you have a timeline that you want that to be set up so that you can, in fact, keep yourselves accountable for it and have a timeline. And then milestones to start to change the process. Anybody who's changed process in an organization knows that doesn't happen quickly. So put milestones in place to understand when certain aspects of the process need to have changed. And then most importantly, make sure you communicate this out through the org so that they understand the progress that's being made, the timelines that are happening, and celebrate the wins that you have around this too. At the same time, you really have to stay aware of challenges as you take on this journey. It's so easy to deprioritize accessibility related items for really any reason, because they're taking more time, because the team is still learning how to do those and do those efficiently. Deprioritizing because maybe something in the design doesn't work for the stakeholder, so you're just going to take that accessibility part out of it for now. Doing this is how you also break the habit if things get deprioritized. So do your best not to do that. You may also work with vendors and partners who may not have the same passion for accessibility that your organization does. And so you really have to lay out for them what the expectations are to make sure that they're going to deliver to you as your vendor. Siloed team structures can also be problematic here, where there's no central process, which is why it's important to make sure as you're establishing policy that you're considering how different parts of the organization work so that you're giving them ways to adopt the new policy and be centralized to that aspect while they're maintaining their autonomy as a siloed team. It's a balance there that has to be dealt with. And then you may have people inside the organization who may be resistant. I come up against this all the time with organizations that I work with, where there's pockets of people who really want to do accessibility work beyond just remediation, but there's people somewhere else above them or adjacent to them who may be resistant to adding this to processes, making it something that's always important in their minds. And those, you've got to, take the time to really educate them to help them understand why this is important. So usually, you're sitting somewhere in an organization, you probably have people who are below you in the organization chart doing this work. You've got people who are above you in management, whether it's just management of your team or broader, executive management through the organization. You've also got people, to the side of you in the organization chart, the people who are on your immediate team, If you're a product manager, you're certainly working, with the designers, the developers, the QA folks to make these projects happen. If you're in the UI UX team, you've got your immediate colleagues, plus the people that you work with in development, QA, content creation, to who are realizing your designs to put them on the site. And that's kind of how I think about top down and sideways, because no matter where you are in the org, there are people above you, below you, and adjacent and sideways to you in the org chart that you can be talking to. So we already talked about that accessibility champions, there's some key ones that you want from the execs and from DEI and, from team leaders, but really also, across the entire org. The people who are champions who can help influence and create others come from everywhere. It could be individuals and even entire departments working on digital products. So, the UI UX teams often where I see accessibility start to take root because UI UX understands the impact in their designs and they want to design for the widest number of users to be able to use whatever it is they're creating. So they're often a place where it can start, but this could start with one person, the department, kind of saying this is important and starting to talk about it. Employees, out in other places in the organization, even outside the digital teams, who may have family and friends who are living with disabilities. They may not necessarily want to step up and be the ones who are the forefront because they're already, probably advocating for their friends and family in a lot of places, but they can also become advocates to start talking in the organization about the impacts of not having accessible digital properties. The same is true if there are employees who also live with disabilities. Now, what I will say about this category and even the other one is you don't want to force these people to have to talk. Again, because they're already probably having to advocate in so many areas, they may not feel, that they want to take up or have the capacity to take up dealing with it and to help change in their workplace. But they can be certainly champions and advocates if they want to take on that role and have the desire to do so. Certainly DEI can speak a lot about the impacts of making sure that the digital properties, both internal facing and external facing, are accessible because it speaks directly to equity and inclusion and diversity. And of course, the legal team can also be a good champion and talk about accessibility because they're looking at things through the lens of legal risk that they want to help mitigate to make sure that, there's not, suits coming into the company because of the accessibility of the sites. Education is key to building champions. Everybody I talk to who kind of has that aha moment about, suddenly, understanding why this is so important, that's the story that they can start to share. And education and being able to have information at your fingertips to be able to have these conversations with your team members and other people in the organization, can help foster that understanding. So, it starts with statistics on the disabled community and the types of disabilities there are. There's still a huge misconception throughout web organizations that we primarily do this work for people who are blind using screen readers. And that is absolutely an important segment of the population, but there's so much more in accessibility that, could help people understand it better. Having examples at the ready of accessibility issues that are present on your company's website and apps, even, email communication that goes out and social media posts, and being able to talk about one or two and the impacts that those would have to people who are trying to access your company's projects or products rather. Having at the ready some high-level details on what can and should be done across the organization to help get accessibility going. We talked about that, a great example, many examples about that in the previous section of this webinar that you could talk about. And also have resources available that the organization can get started and to build a program. The UsableNet webinar library is a great example of that because we talk about various aspects of this routinely in our webinar series about how to get started, how to build the program, and how to talk about it. I've got a few conversation starters you can think about here as well. And it can very much start with, do we know how accessible our website is? And if nobody can answer that question, then you've got a great conversation starter there about why it's important. Or If they do know how accessible it is, it's like, why aren't we doing the work? Which leads directly to, what steps can we take to get an audit performed? What's needed? Is it budget? Is it time? Is it resources? What is that? And how do we get past that so that we can actually start to understand more about the breadth of work we may have to do there to remediate? What can you do to help kickstart the project? And I think this can really come from anywhere in the organization. It's particularly helpful if you're within the digital team, but even if you're not, and you're talking to somebody who is, how can they help? Well, they may recommend to help them educate somebody else. Or, if you're in a position where you can help them, connect with the right people to maybe get the project going. It's a valid question to ask, even if you may get, well, we're working on it, but if I think of something, I'll come back to you and see how you can help us. Who else do we need to get on board for this project? This is a big one, because who needs to do this? Is it product owners? Is it another product stakeholder who might be the product owner? Is it someone further up in the org? Is it someone in the IT org? Understanding who needs to get on board can help you go have conversations with the right people to get it moving. Now, if you're in that area where accessibility is a project, you can start with, I know we're working on accessibility, but what can we do to improve and increase the inclusivity? Those conversations can happen all across the software development lifecycle because, again, UI, UX, content creators, developers, QA all play a role in that and all have slightly different responsibilities over aspects of accessibility. So starting to have the conversation with those teams, with individuals, with the team leaders, how can we improve this and increase inclusivity, which can then, bubble up further up the chain to try to get more prioritization put on that. Moving exactly to that, getting more people on board. It might be people on teams, getting them to make sure they're doing accessibility work as they're doing their existing work, encouraging education. It could be talking to some of the stakeholders to get more time and resources to be able to support the accessibility to improve it faster. If possible, if you work in the digital teams, can you get involved? If you're a developer and you know that just UI UX is working on it, as a developer, you can say, how can I get involved and help doing this, in implementing what UI UX has done, in taking care of the things that are in, the audits that we get back. You could ask pointedly somebody else if they can get involved in the accessibility efforts, which is where some of those things on having the discussions that help educate people on the issues can lead directly. Can you get involved to help us break down barriers in getting this work done, in being able to talk to other people to get them on board? It's really kind of that grassroots effort where you just keep expanding the network out. And then how do we improve so we're not creating new issues in future audits and testing? And that's kind of that nudge in this one to where you're starting to shift left, where you're really starting to think about the future work and how you integrate at that level where it's not just a project, but it's part of your requirements. And I know I've moved through this kind of quickly, and I don't want to make it sound like these are the easiest conversations to happen, but asking these questions to people who are all over the organization, around you, to start moving these things forward. It could be a simple conversation with the person who's immediately your supervisor up in the chain, so that person then takes the message across their level of the organization with the goal of keep moving it up. But if you do anything like town halls where you're, talking to other people, in a broader way in the organization, you could start to raise these questions, if you're comfortable with it. And I imagine, being comfortable with it starts with being able to just have those talking points that I had earlier, a couple of slides back. And then, that kind of, pinnacle of what you're looking for is, how do we move it even further left so that we're not managing everything at the end, or managing in that reactive way that you're probably still doing when you're in accessibility as a project. So what do I recommend as next steps through all this? Well, to get started, it's really understanding where your organization is around accessibility. You may already know where your organization is in certain aspects, But if you have a lot of digital properties, maybe you're only focusing on the website first, but the apps haven't really been touched yet. Or maybe you have it expanded for your content team to look at emails and social media. You can start to look at all of that and pin down even more about where your organization is rather for accessibility. Develop your personal target list of people and teams and groups you want to talk to. I've seen, UI UX teams in organizations, create lunch and learns for other teams in the organization to come in and have a discussion about accessibility. So there's various ways you can, approach this as you develop this list of people that you want to help educate on this particular topic. Decide on what your conversation starters are. I listed a few out earlier. And as you get the recording for this and the deck for this, you can, kind of plan what your conversation starter is and the things you want to talk about your organization's digital properties to help educate people and start conversations around accessibility. And then have those meaningful conversations. You might want to test it out with, people that you're well connected with who are, going to be, not, that you feel most comfortable to have these initial conversations with. But then as you have them, you can build a coalition of people to help have more of the conversation, but then you'll be more confident in talking about it as well. Recruit, obviously, those you talk with to help them become champions. If they're not in this webinar, share this webinar with them so they can start to think about these things themselves, or you can teach them the things that we're talking about here so that they become the champions. And then as you build more and more champions, it's how do you take this message and create either the initial change because you're just starting out, the change that's necessary to move further left, or the change and continued change that you need to continue to evolve how you're treating accessibility, even as you have that progress in moving left. I'll refer you again to the Skyscanner webinar, where, as I said, 4 years in, they're still looking at ways to continue to mature because it's really a never-ending conversation and look at processes in the same way that accessibility is an ongoing journey that never stops. And always have in mind goals and timelines. That way you're keeping, that way the organization has a framework to stay accountable to these things and understands where they are. And again, celebrate those wins too. That's key. So the organization understands why these things are so important. And that's one of the places being able to develop the center of excellence I talked about can really help so that there's a place who's keeping track of all that and sharing out, both the wins and the challenges that are being had. And be accountable. I should have hit that button one more time to pop that up before I said it. But yes, be accountable to those goals and timelines so that that there is, the ongoing effort to make sure you're hitting those. And I'll wrap up here with a quote that comes from the book Good Talk: How to Design Conversations That Matter by Daniel Stillman. Waiting for someone else to act won't do. If we see the problem, we have to do something about it. If we want others to open up to new possibilities, we might try to open as well. It's our responsibility to frame the challenge so that others can be open to exploring the issue. I love this book. It's got so many great details and how to create different conversations that could be had on any number of things. And I think it really connects well to the accessibility topic because it's new for so many people. And for those of us who know accessibility, finding the right ways to talk about it is so key. So I hope this presentation, helped all of you understand to how, and to think about how you could start having these conversations with other people to help the organization move forward in a good, accessible way. So with that, we can definitely do some Q&A. Definitely reach out to me after this is over. You've got my email address here, jeff.adams@usablenet.com. You could also connect with me on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/Jeffrey Allen Adams, because my name is too common for me not to have to stick my middle name in there. So with that, Bethany, what do we have for questions?
So we had a few questions come in. This one was anonymous. With the pervasiveness of layoffs, what tactics can we use to make the case for more resources working on accessibility?
Great question, because we know that that has been an impact, particularly, within this calendar year so far, around layoffs. I think you have one of the things I like to equate accessibility to is with internet security. So IT security, as well as the things that are in place around things like privacy and cookie management and those things that are just inherent to the things that we must think about. You can't, ignore security because you can't risk a data breach. You can't ignore the privacy regulations that are in effect across the US, particularly here in California where I live. So many things around privacy. You've also got, legislation that's in place. If you're doing business in the EU, there are things that are in place out throughout Europe that have to be done, by June of next year. There's accessibility laws if you're doing business in Canada. You can't just leave this to the side. So at the same time, you can't ignore what your customers need at the same time. 25% of people live with a permanent disability. And I think when you take all of those pieces together, it should be a compelling argument for the organization to understand that they must focus on accessibility for their customers and to make sure that they're complying with the laws that exist in the places they may do business in. Even here in the US, an e-commerce site doesn't have a law that says they must do something. But the way the litigation goes, they're able to leverage existing laws to be able to make claims on accessibility, to use the ADA to call out discrimination, even though there's not something like the new European Accessibility Act in the US. All of those things combined, should make the case for why accessibility is important. Otherwise, the organization itself, runs the risk of having to pay out, you know, settlement fees if they're getting sued or if they're doing business somewhere else, paying fines, um, against the EAA and things like that. It's not an easy conversation to have, in the organizations in any way, but I think it's about education and making it clear that, in this day and age, it's not something that can be left by the wayside. And I should say at the same time, I'm not an attorney and not providing legal advice as part of this webinar, since I did touch on legal things just a little bit there.
Yes, well said. This webinar is for educational purposes, not legal advice. We always want to make that disclaimer on here. Okay, I see a couple more questions coming in. Who should the responsibility fall on for compliance? The company or the agency that built their site? Is there a trend of that responsibility moving towards the agency?
That's a great question. Uh, and it's a difficult one to answer too. And I think this got brought into the forefront, especially as the new Title II requirements came out earlier. I think it was back in April of this year, where the new Title II requirements for organizations who are selling website digital services to the government said something, and I don't have the language right in front of me, but it's something equivalent of it's not only what you might produce as the person selling to the government, but it's also the expectation that things that you're bringing into the site from a third party are also accessible. And often what we might be getting from third parties and from vendors might be out of our control in terms of how what its accessibility is, or they might be doing work for you even for the site itself, and you don't know if they're giving you accessible content. And it's definitely something that has to be considered. I advocate for, making sure in your agreements with third parties, who you might be getting widgets for. Like if you're an e-commerce site, you might be getting, a chatbot widget or a reviews widget or, other things around payment processors, even that you're injecting into checkout. Make sure that you're getting accessible WCAG 2.2 or at least minimum 2.1 conforming things, and that if need be, that vendor's providing you clear written details on what they've done. And if you're working with a vendor to design your site, to give you UI UX, to give you coding work, to give you content creation, testing, all of that, that they're contracted to give you, accessible WCAG conforming deliverables back. Now, the trick with that is for you as the contracting organization is having something in place where you can actually verify that they've given you what they've said they're going to give you. I've seen too many instances where, unfortunately, vendors say they've delivered conforming material, and then down the line somewhere it's seen that they didn't. Which, worst case is you figure that out because you get a lawsuit related to it. Uh, so I think, A, put it in your contracts. B, demand proof of what that is, whether it's a VPAT, whether it's an audit report, or, UsableNet does this a lot with our partners. We may audit things that they get via third party, whether it's a component or, other content, to make sure that it is accessible. Because at the end of the day, what you put onto your website or your app is your responsibility, even if you didn't create it. So, I mean, that's a really great question. And, it's not an easy answer because you really want to believe that vendors who say they're giving you accessible stuff are in fact doing that. But I've seen a lot of examples, unfortunately, where that's not the case. So you need to contract for it and then have some methodologies in place that you're able to prove it.
Okay. So let's refocus a little bit. Do you have any best practices to support adoption of accessibility standards on internal company digital platforms? Those platforms used by employees only.
This has been an interesting one to deal with over the years because often the things that might be the internal tools aren't built by internal resources. Everything from using Salesforce in an organization, or what your email platform is, or the things that, the ticketing system that you use, if you use Jira or something else. And as I call out names, I'm not implying at all that they're either accessible or not, but whatever those things are, they're often not homegrown built. But you also have the responsibility to your employees to make sure that, they're able to do their work. And if need be, there's accommodations in place for those things so that they can do the work. Again, as you're contracting and procuring these items, what's the accessibility of it? I think these days, if somebody who's selling something like that can't tell you that, that's a red flag. I even go so far as to recommend, especially if you're starting with somebody new, getting a new thing, look on their site for their accessibility statement and their accessibility policies. If they're not being public about that, for me, that's a red flag, and definitely something you'd want to ask for if you really want their product. You could also go and do just inventory. What do you have that your employees use? And it'll be a giant list. But start to understand, where you got it from. Start to understand, what its accessibility is currently. Like, what does the company say about the accessibility of that product that you have? If it's homegrown, start to understand, what its accessibility is, because those are the ones you can audit and that you can control the fix. Often, though, internally, there's hundreds of apps that are out there. I've done this work with large organizations, even ones who build it themselves, and some of it's so legacy that fixing it would be difficult. So I think you need to understand what you have, start to understand what the status of that product is, who's using it, and, make fixes where you can in areas where it might be third party. If you're looking at upgrading or changing it, getting that information. But then also really understanding, and this is a place where your HR department or your DEI part of your organization can help, is understand, are there employees who have been impacted by these tools that they need accommodation? Because those might be the ones you even take on trying to fix first to improve the experience for the people that are using it. Yeah, internal to me is is in many ways more difficult than dealing with the public facing things, just because there's so many things that go internally in an organization. So I hope that gave you a little bit of guidance, but it's really, I always recommend starting with an inventory to know what you've got and kind of the accessibility that you can either perceive in the product by your own usage because you've got the understanding, or starting to talk to the vendors that where it came from to understand the accessibility and their commitment to that accessibility.
So we did get a comment on that. I wanted to read aloud. Um, they said that not so much a question as a statement, just asking for an accessibility conformance report can open doors. They worked with a vendor who had never done one, and then that vendor worked with them to understand the accessibility issues in the app and put fixes on their roadmap.
Yeah, and that has happened a lot with some of the folks that we work around Title II who have external vendors that they're working with that come into their site. They ask for a VPAT or some other kind of conformance report to start to understand, what that vendor is providing to them. And then, often that can kick off a vendor starting their own accessibility journey as well, if it's the first time they've heard that.
So that's an interesting softball to another question that we have, which is what is most effective ways to get buy-in from executives in B2B organizations?
B2B is some of my favorite conversations to have because there's some perception that B2B is outside of this somehow because, it's a smaller pool of people who might be engaging with it. But I still come back to, the basic statistics around disability anyway. 25% of people live with a permanent disability. If you include people who might be experiencing an episodic, situational, or temporary disability, that number can easily get into the 40 to 50%. If you think about it, each day, how big is it because of the people experiencing something that's not permanent? Extrapolate that to your B2B audience. And so you've got probably not an insignificant number of people who are using the B2B who are part of the disabled community, either permanently or temporarily through what they have. And I think that number can be key to starting to have the conversation about why being accessible to B2B is important, because you don't want to have, let's say your biggest customer, something happens and, all of a sudden they're blind through, let's do an accident happens and they're blind and it's your biggest customer. And now they're navigating your site and it's not accessible. And you're like, oh, well, we weren't really dealing with accessibility. We're sorry. We've got to go fix that. But still, now you've got your biggest customer not able to use the site. It's not worth the risk to not start trying to build accessibility in. And it's, that's a big story to give there. But I think the proof is in the numbers that this is not a small part of the population that you run the risk of not serving, even in a B2B mode. And even in an internal mode too. I mean, the same kind of story goes for the internal tools. And, not being able to accommodate your own employees who, may experience a sudden disability just through life. And so I think those are the conversations you have to start to have around that to serve the people well, and leaving all the legal implications on the side. It's really about serving people and your customers in a good, accessible, and inclusive way.
And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.